Okay, simple summary this week is about the Mexican-American War, which happened in the late 1840s, and its effect on increasing the tensions about slavery. It is not an accident that the war with Mexico happened in the late 1840s, and only 12 years later, the Civil War began. These events are indirectly but clearly related. There had been tension over slavery for decades, as we've seen in the course already, previous assignments and smart book assignments and things like that. The North pretty much didn't want slavery. The South needed it for its economy, an agricultural economy, or at least they perceived that they needed it. And it's a question of morality running up against economics, basically. And the tension was always simmering under the surface. And there were various compromises, the Missouri Compromise being the big one, where they basically kept slavery out of, above a certain line it didn't exist, and below a certain line geographically it did exist. And then in 1846, the United States went to war with Mexico. Now, that could be its own thing. We don't have time, but I'll boil it down in very simple terms. The president at the time, a man named James K. Polk, essentially started a war with Mexico. He sent troops to the Mexican border and across the Mexican border because there was a dispute about where the border was between Mexico and the United States, because this was still, Mexico was still salty about Texas having had a revolution and broken free. And to send troops into that area is to provoke a potential enemy, and that's what happened. And basically the United States wanted that war because the U.S. knew it could win. Most of the wars in American history, you can point to the United States as the good guy, fighting a revolution for its own freedom, fighting to preserve the freedom of the people of Europe in World War I, World War II, Korea to try to prevent South Korea from being conquered, the Gulf War to try to liberate Kuwait. To be completely honest, you can't make much of a case for the United States as the good guy in the war with Mexico. Just not there. I don't think that's an unpatriotic thing to say. I just think it's being realistic. So this war happened because the United States wanted it and because the United States knew it could win. And I won't go through the details of the war itself to keep things short. But it was a quick war. It was only a couple of years. It was basically enough. How much time do you need to get enough troops down there and enough forces to fight battles? And next thing you know, the American army is in Mexico City, and Mexico is asking for peace, essentially surrendering. And as a result of that defeat, Mexico gave up a huge parcel of land. It's basically gave up forever the idea that they were ever going to get Texas back. And most of the southwestern United States, Arizona, just basically a huge section, parts of Lower California, were given over to the United States. Now, if you're looking at the country, okay, that's a good thing, right? Now you have more land, there's places to grow, you can develop these cities, people can move there. The map kind of looks from after the Mexican War like it does now. You would recognize the shape of the country. But here's the problem with that. Forget the morality of starting a war with Mexico just to take their stuff, which is what we did. Now you have immediate questions about whether that land, all that new land, that millions of acres of new land, is going to be free or is it going to be slave? Because people are going to settle there. They're going to turn those territories into states. Are those states going to be free states? Are they going to be slave states? And one of the reasons that it was super important to people is those states, once they became states in the Congress, would have voting power. And so the North worried that a huge amount of slave states would mean more Southern power in Congress. And the South definitely worried that more free states would mean more Northern power in Congress, and that they would essentially be run by the North. And so this took things that were tense but quiet and unspoken and brought them right out into the open. And how can I shorten this? Let me see. There were people in the Congress who were very skilled at making deals and making compromises and keeping things calm. Henry Clay, in particular, was a person that was a master at this sort of thing. He was from Kentucky, which was a border state, right? He's the perfect person to try to bridge the gap between people in the South like John C. Calhoun and people in the North like Daniel Webster, people who were dedicated to getting rid of slavery, people who were dedicated to keeping it forever. But those kind of big figures got old. And in the 1850s, by the mid-1850s, they were gone. The kind of people who could, these big titans in Congress, these hugely consequential people, were gone. And the people that came after them just weren't as good. There is another titan, which is ironic since he was actually a short person, and that is a man named Stephen Douglas. And Douglas was from Illinois. He was a U.S. senator. He was a rival of Abraham Lincoln, actually. Lincoln at this time was nobody. Lincoln had been a congressman for 2 years from Illinois and then went back to the practice of law. He was not on the stage at all. He just was not a known figure. And so Douglas was the dominant political force in Illinois politics. He was a Democrat. He was a Northern Democrat. So this idea, by the way, that the Democrats were for slavery and the Republicans were against it is an oversimplification. It depends not on which party you belong to, but which part of the country. You could be a Northern Democrat and be against it. You could be a Republican living in the North and be against it. If you were a Southerner, you were for it generally. So it's not about Democrat versus Republican in terms of slavery. Stephen Douglas introduced a bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what that bill did was allow the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves by vote if they wanted to be free states or slave states. And while that might sound good, right, you're just leaving it up to the people who live there, what that did was that destroyed the previous deal, the Missouri Compromise, which had kept things pretty calm. Slavery was prohibited above a certain point and was allowed below a certain point, and this just wrecked that. And the other thing that it did was it destroyed the Whig Party, because the Whigs, W-H-I-G, by the way, were the opposition party to the Democrats, and they divided along over this issue. And so they went away. And so you have the Democratic Party, and there's going to be another party, and it's in the 1850s, that a new party was developed called the Republican Party. And contrary to popular belief, Lincoln did not start the Republican Party, but he was one of the early people who joined it. He was a former Whig who had admired Henry Clay and joined the Republican Party. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act really set in motion the Civil War. It was years before, but the country was on a downward slide towards war by that point. Douglas continued to be a powerful voice in Congress, didn't really get blamed for this. And in fact, in 1858, he was reelected to the Senate, and in that election, he defeated Abraham Lincoln for the Illinois Senate seat. And so Lincoln, which hopefully I'll get a chance to talk more about him in a personal sense in the next module. But Lincoln's story is very interesting because we remember him as this titan who, maybe the greatest president of all time. But until the moment he became president in 1860, or was elected president in 1860, he was kind of a failure. He didn't get anything that he wanted in life. He didn't get to marry the girl that he liked. He didn't have the education that he wanted. He grew up poor. He had to work with his hands for the first 30 years of his life, manual labor. He ran for office and didn't get it over and over again. And then finally, towards the end, as we'll see, he became successful. So this period that I want you to understand is that the war with Mexico in the late 1840s was a catalyst for the Civil War a dozen years later. It set the United States on that path. It was kind of like the fire that was set, or the conditions to set a fire that would blaze up in 1860. And I'll talk more about the war itself in next week's module, but that's the basic thing that I want you to be able to understand. Make sure that you write a full summary of these events in your own words. I need to be able to tell that you listened to me talking today, and that the questions reflect that, the answers to the questions reflect that as well. Okay, that's all.